Here in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 this morning, we have gone through our whole introduction that was about Solomon specifically. We believe this is the wisdom of Solomon. And Solomon had access to anything and everything. He had honor from other nations, and he's the king of Israel, so nobody could tell him no. And we see that he tries everything, and we get some conclusions all along the way. Chapter 1 was sort of a prologue that was just saying, hey, guess what? Life is meaningless. You know, if there's nothing outside of this physical existence and it's just life under the sun, this is meaningless, this is pointless. And to bring in a New Testament sort of line to apply to this, we of all men are to be most pitied. If this is all that there is, then we are really in for it. And then chapter 2, or really the end of chapter 1, we see the preacher's quest sort of starts. He says, I'm seeking and setting my heart with wisdom to find fulfillment in life under the sun. And so in chapter 2, he goes through these earthly pleasures. I mean, anything and everything that he wanted to try, he did, no matter how morally okay or not okay it was. Solomon tried it, and he said, you know what? That didn't fulfill, and it's not worth it. That's vanity and striving after wind. He tried, these different wisdom tactics, probably earthly knowledge, earthly education, earthly, whatever you want to call it. And he says, there is some benefit to wisdom, but at the end of the day, it's still useless. It's still vanity because I'm going to die just like this guy down the street who is the most foolish man on the planet. So what advantage is there to this wisdom? He says there isn't one. And then we got to the end of chapter 2 and we saw really both of those things come together where he was saying, I'm just going to die like anybody else is going to die. So why do I work so hard? I don't know if the stuff I'm going to leave to the people after me is going to last. So why am I striving so hard? What's the advantage? And the conclusion is there isn't an advantage. And then if you remember from the end of chapter 2, we see God come into the picture just a little bit. And when God comes into the picture, it completely changes his tune. He says it is good for people to enjoy the fruits of their labor. That is the hand of God. It's the gift of God. And who can have enjoyment without God? So when God comes into the picture, the tune completely changes. And with that said, in chapter 3, we're going to see God come into the picture again. And it feels really good in the second half of chapter 3. But the first half of chapter 3, we've really got to sit in what Solomon is saying in this, just like all along the way. When God's not in the picture, it's going to feel really bad because it is really bad when God's not in the picture. But then you put God in the picture and it's going to feel completely different. And so that's where we're going to pick up in chapter 3. Before we dive into chapter 3, any thoughts or comments leading up to this? All right. Well, let's dive right in. Let's read the first 9 verses together, please. First 9 verses. There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing, a time to search and a time to give up as lost, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Verse 9, what profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? So in these first 9 verses, just the way that I count it, I could have missed some very easily, but the way that I count it here in the New American Standard 95 version here, the word time is used 30 times in 9 verses. I mean, that's a lot. So I think we've got to notice there's something being talked about time here. And if we miss that, I don't know if we're even reading the text this morning. 30 times just in these 9 verses. And if you look at these verses, this really looks like the whole spectrum of human experience, doesn't it? When you look at the things that are mentioned here, the poetic structure here is called a mirror. And in this poetic structure, it sort of gives you opposite extremes. But in the poetic structure, it's not just those extremes. By saying, okay, there's a time for, let's see, in verse 2, a time to give birth and a time to die. It's not just saying there's only a time for birth and there's only a time for death, right? He's saying everything in between that. So this poetic structure is saying there's a time for birth, every single stage throughout a person's life, and then there's a time for death at the end of that. And so as we're looking at this, it's not just birth and death, but it's everything in between. And we can say that with any of these. It's the whole spectrum of human experience, whether that's a good thing, whether that's a bad thing, every single thing in between. And I think that's going to be really important because there's several here we've talked about in chapter 2, maybe some of the moral character or moral nature of the things that Solomon is going for. There's probably a couple things in here that we might feel at least a little bit uncomfortable with. And there's a time for such and such and a time for such and such. Just one that sticks out to me is verse 8. You know, some people might really have a problem with saying there's a time to hate. You know, that seems a little, I don't know, is that on the edge there? Or maybe a time for war. Some people are just completely against war, don't like it, no matter what the cause, no matter what it is. War's bad, right? Well, Solomon is saying there's a time for all of these things. There's a time to throw away in verse 6. A time to give up is lost in verse 6. So there's the whole breadth of human experience is being listed here. And I think it's important for us to see at the end of verse 1, for every event under heaven. It doesn't say under the sun, but that's our phrase, under the sun, under heaven. So what is Solomon talking about in these first couple of verses here? Seems like this is life without God. Even with God, we're going to see that this is the case. But when he says under the sun or under heaven, the vast majority of the time here in Ecclesiastes, he's talking about just life here on planet Earth with nothing else outside of it. And I think that's going to be really, really important. A lot of these things happen no matter what we do. Is that fair to say? A lot of these things happen no matter what we do. And I think that's why in verse 9, he asked this question, where he asked this question. What profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? We've seen that question a couple of times now from Solomon. But think about it specifically in what he's just observed. He's looking around, he's saying, you know what? There's an appointed time for everything. You know, the whole breadth of human experience is going to happen no matter what I do. And this is the king of Israel at this point who could wage war on somebody like that if he wanted to, or strike up a peace deal, or marry somebody to strike up a peace deal. And yet he says, what advantage is there? What profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? No matter what he does, no matter what anybody does, it might not be in my lifetime, but this stuff is going to happen regardless of what I do. And I think that's a huge thing for us to notice here. We don't know when it's going to happen. We might not know how these things are going to work out. But if you just examine life under the sun, life under heaven, you know what? There are births that happen. There are deaths that happen in the exact same day. You know, there's a time to plant. There's a time to uproot what's planted. And in all of these things, it's kind of like no matter what you do, these things are going to continue to go on. And that's exactly what we saw in chapter 1. Yes, sir.
At least to me, that all kind of combines in this idea where he says he's made everything appropriate, and the literal translation there is beautiful. And as you mentioned, like in verse 8, where it says there's a time to hate, and we think, well, when should we ever hate? Well, the book of Proverbs talks about 7 things that God hates. What God hates, I should hate. So there are times where hate is appropriate. There are times, obviously the opposite of that, where love is appropriate. And so it strikes me that what Solomon is saying is that there is a time for this kind of reaction. There is a time for this kind of reaction. And the true wisdom is understanding which is which.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to hold on getting there because that is where we're going. And even in what you're saying, which is so absolutely true and exactly where we're going, think about the way you just said this made me think about this. Think about the humanist viewpoint of life under the sun without God. Think about the materialist viewpoint. How many signs do you see where it's like love, not war? You know, or it's love, not hate, or any of those things. So even with God out of the picture, some of these things seem a little bit morally questionable, can we say, at the very least? People who are highly materialistic or, you know, humanist or whatever word you want to say there. And it's like, I'm not sure if I'm okay with these things. And Solomon's point is, even in life without God, even if you're not okay with it, what are you going to do to stop it? Life under the sun continues the same way that it's gone. We saw in chapter 1, you know, one generation comes up and another one goes away. Hey, we really hate war because we've just seen it. But then you get 2 generations away and people forget about that. And so then here comes war again. And so Solomon's saying, what profit is there in all this labor that a man does under the sun? These things just repeat. Might not be in your lifetime. You might not know when it's going to happen, but time moves on. It's sort of the point here. Time moves on no matter what you do. And so because of this, my little title for this section is Life is Predictable, but Not Always. And if that's not an indication of life under the sun, I don't know what is. Life is predictable, but not always. And what I mean by that is in this section, you know that these things are going to happen, right? You know, generally speaking, that these types of things are going to happen in life under the sun. But do you know exactly when it's going to affect you? Not really. We don't really know that. We can say, okay, these things are going to happen, so you better be prepared when those things happen. And then even if we're prepared for them, when they happen, isn't it still a shocker? It's still a surprise to us. It is. Life is predictable in that these things happen, but not really in how they affect us or when they do or when that hits us. Any thoughts on any of that before we keep going? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Ongoing process, but still, it comes as an alarm. Every time that somebody invents or discovers something new in CERN, Switzerland, and the atomic, something. So it's a shock. We know it's there. We just don't understand it yet. There's a reference pattern. Well, I guess what I'm saying is there's a reference pattern to this in God's creation that we tend to ignore sometimes when we read these things. But we shouldn't consider ourselves to be outside of that same creation.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. What David was just saying is that natural disasters and just creation is the very same. And that's exactly why I think Solomon starts in chapter 1, right after talking about how things are cyclical. He's like, yeah, the wind blows to the north and it goes back to the south. Those streams go into the ocean, it's not full, so they go back to where they are. So yeah, those cycles and things that repeat, no matter what we do, yeah, I think that's one of Solomon's points. So I really appreciate that. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Just to keep rolling off of that's something I've never considered before, but it's a really great point. It's just the laws of nature are God's laws. He set this all up. So yeah, this idea of there's always an equal and opposite reaction, like Einstein may have discovered that, or whoever discovered that law, but God set it in motion, and I think that's really cool when you extrapolate that to how often God gives us parables or analogies of nature, because that was his creation. That is what he set into motion. So he's giving us examples of things like a lot of like aha moments as humans thinking you discovered something, but God put that in place to begin with. He's being able to reference his own work and make it understandable for us through verses like this. But it's really cool when you put two and two together.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. And part of the beginning where you were talking there, I just saw something the other day where there was this lady who was convinced that gravity was invented by Isaac Newton. It was really funny, and it really connects with what we were talking about last week and the week before that in Ecclesiastes, where there's nothing new. Can anybody say, see, look, this is new? We're just calling it by a different name. And it's God's creation. God set it up that way. Let's see. Anything else on this section? Okay, well, one of the things I want us to notice in these first verses is, what is the master? This is a terrible way to ask this question, but what is the master in verses 1 through 9? Or what is the controlling factor in verses 1 through 9? Time, yes. And I really think that brings us to the question of verse 9, which is, what profit is there in all this work? Because time goes on. Time controls, these things are going to happen, the whole breadth of human experience. And so what profit is there? On top of that, Solomon's already talked about this, and I think he's continuing this here, that we are limited by time. We know that time moves on, things go in cycles, the whole breadth of human experience is going to continue, but it might not be in our time because our time is limited, but time will go on. And so I think that's really important for us, that we are limited by time. Time is the controlling factor. If you're looking at life under the sun without God, then time is the master, because you're limited and it's just going to move on. And so that can be really depressing, but then that's why we go to the next couple of verses. Any thoughts before we keep going to these next couple of verses? Okay. Well, this is the part that starts to feel really nice, because that doesn't feel good. Let's look at verses 9 through 11 here. 9 through 11. Let's reread verse 9. What profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? I have seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. He has made everything appropriate, or your translation might say beautiful in its time. In its time. Think about that for a second. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. And so here is this massive contrast where God comes into the picture. Again, if you're doing this marking thing, you're going to notice some yellow comes in here. When God comes in the picture, if you're underlining in yellow, it's really helpful throughout Ecclesiastes. Because then he says, okay, what profit is there to the worker in that which he toils? Verse 10, he says, I've seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. God has given some kind of task here. What's this task that's being talked about in verse 10?
I think they're most of the things they talk about in verses 2 through 8. Except for birth and death, both of these things are things we decide.
Mm-hmm.
Do we decide to gather? Do we decide to cast away? Do we decide to embrace? Do we decide to shun embrace? They'll tear down, sew together. These are all choices we make.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. These are all choices that we make. And then we make these choices usually dependent on the time of the year or the time or the people don't like this very often, but the season that we're in or whatever it is. And yeah, absolutely. A lot of these are choices that we make. And he says this is the task that God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. And so I think it is the choices, but then maybe there's another layer on top just coming from these first couple of verses. Any thoughts on? Yes, sir. Yeah, burden. So any thoughts on that, on burden?
Something right after all these tasks here, seems like a hard to continue one to the next level. Responsibility to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just as a direct result of, we know that time goes on, so much of our limited time is spent. How do we respond to the situation that I am in right now? I mean, how much of our time do we spend pondering that question? How am I supposed to respond right? What am I supposed to do given the time that I'm in and the things that are going on in my life? You know, we have a choice in a lot of these reactions here. But then if you take another step back from the burden of how am I supposed to respond because time's going to move on and I'm limited, if we just take another little step back away from this, it's also when you know that your time is limited, when you know that time moves on and things are going to happen, that can be really despairing. And that's a burden. It's like, man, nothing that I do is really going to last. Nothing I do is going to change these things that are going to happen in my lifetime or after my lifetime. And that can be a burden on top of itself. So who's in control? What's in control? Who can we lean on in this? I think that's where we get verse 11. He has made everything appropriate or beautiful in its time. Now that is fascinating to me because we've just seen in this whole section where time is the master. Time is the force that moves things and you have to respond based on what's going on in the time that you live in. But then here's God who steps in the picture. And God is the one who makes everything beautiful in its time. God is the one who makes everything appropriate in its time. Time is not the master here. God is the master of time. God is the controlling factor. He's the motivating operation that gets this whole ball rolling. Isn't that huge and a drastic difference from what Solomon's been talking about here in this chapter this morning? Anybody have any thoughts on that before we keep going? Yes, sir.
I've never seen this before, but just sitting on this verse, it kind of feels like garden language a little bit. He's saying that God made everything beautiful, and then here it is, the workers gained from their toil. We know when sin entered. First of all, that brought in death, which gave us a ticking clock. That brought in time. And then additional to that, it gave us our toil. We know that we burdened Adam with hard labor. Mm-hmm. So it just feels like kind of a reflection of the fall of man in a lot of ways, the sin entered the world. Like God made everything perfect, eternal, beautiful in its time, and we ruined that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great observation to make from this. And I think it's really appropriate given what's coming next in verse 11 as well. So I really appreciate that. Any other comments on these verses up to this point?
All family, all children, all siblings, all parents, and untimely point in life, very young, or right at the moment of achievement, something happens or what have you. I know my youngest brother died at 18 and he was already achieving his career goals as a college student and of three brothers, he's the one that seemed to be the one that was on the path to get something done. Snap, automobile accident, he's gone. And it's taken me 6 decades to get to the point where I can deal with that, to be quite honest. It's astounding to me now how this verse confirms what I've learned those years of serving them. And I know people who have not been able to understand why they couldn't achieve whatever it was they wanted to do. They couldn't, get the job they wanted, or they couldn't have a child, or whatever it was. And then later on in life, the beauty of not happening the way they wanted to is evident. And I think there's a lot of real life in this. It isn't just a novel. This is like just culture, motivation stuff here. This is a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I really like that last thing you said, where there's a lot of wisdom and logic here that's not just, did you say poster board?
Culture.
Yeah, absolutely. You got a picture in a dentist office where it's like endurance and there's a whale on it with a nice quote under it. That can be sort of a platitude for, yeah, all right, you're about to sit in the chair and the drill's coming, whatever. But this is Solomon really saying, I have observed that bad stuff happens. And there's a time for good things and there's a time for bad things. And like morally on the fence kind of things it's real life. And that's what happens. And it can seem so despairing that these things happen to us and time just moves on. How cold and critical is that? And yet he says, God is the one who makes everything appropriate in its time. God is the master over time. And yeah, I appreciate that a lot, that comment. Speaking to that, and just thinking about how bad things can happen and God's still in control, I think about the book of Daniel, where over and over and over again, it is said of God that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of man. And it's so significant in the book of Daniel because here's these people, these people from Judah who have been overrun and taken over by the Babylonians, and a bunch of people were killed. I mean, just brutal killings in these attacks and these sieges, and now they're prisoners in a foreign land. And then God starts describing these kingdoms that are going to come afterward. How many people are going to be killed in those killings? And yet God is in control of everything that's going on. His sovereign will, in other words, his overall plan of how things are going to happen is going to be accomplished because he's the one who sets things up, makes things appropriate, makes things beautiful in its time. And it's really important for us to see that. Any thoughts on any of that before we keep going? Okay. All right. So God is behind it all. God is in control of time. He's the master. So then look at the other side of this. He has also, verse 11, he has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning, even to the end. So verse 11, God has set eternity in their hearts. What do we think about that? What does that mean? God set eternity in their hearts.
I've always thought about it as the ability to ponder something that's beyond this under the sun.
Mm-hmm.
That we can't necessarily see it, we can't necessarily touch it, but we can conceive of it in a limited sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that limited sense is going to be really important. But I think that's right, especially given what we've just been reading, where Solomon is making this observation. Time is limited. I am limited by time, and yet time is just going to continue to go on after me like I never existed. My work isn't really going to mean that much. And so that can lead us to despair and be like, why is this so unfair? But we've already seen Solomon mentions God here. And it seems like his conclusion from all of that is, this can't be it. That can't be all there is. If this is all there is, then again, to bring in a New Testament line from this, we of all men are to be most pitied. If this is it, this is meaningless. It's vanity. It's striving after wind. It is striving after wind, grasping for just air. This is useless and pointless. But he says God set eternity in their hearts. And it seems like this is a lot like his quest too, his quest to find fulfillment, his quest to find things that are lasting and things that are meaningful. He says God has set eternity in their hearts so that they'll notice this. When somebody starts thinking this way, you can't shake it, can you? You can kind of ignore it for a little bit. You can willfully ignore it for just a little bit. But once you start thinking like, I really am going to die one day. Is anything that I do in life under the sun going to be meaningful? Is any of this going to be I don't know about you all, by the way, talk about getting real personal. Has anybody in here ever had like those late at night, you can't sleep, you're going through your head. I already see some smiles, so I know I'm not the only one. That makes me feel really good. Real late at night, and you're just pondering, what if none of this is real? Like, what if? Yeah, see, I appreciate that. It's like, what if all this stuff that I truly believe in isn't even real? Because at the end of the day, I'm going to die. That is a reality that I cannot shake. No matter how good shape you are in, no matter whatever it is, I am going to die. What's it going to be like after this? I know I'm not the only one because I saw smiles and stuff. I appreciate that a lot. And so that can lead us to absolute abject despair. And yet, Solomon here, he says, God put that in you to wonder, to think, this can't be all there is. It can't be. God set that in your heart. But then let's notice the other half of this, which is really appreciated by me. At the end of verse 11, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. I've read where some commentators say, oh, God's put eternity in your hearts and he's made it so that you can't figure it out. Look how terrible God is. I don't think that's the point at all. I think that's missing entirely the point that Solomon is making here. It's God has set this in your heart so that you will look beyond just this physical existence. But even in all your seeking with wisdom, even in all of your strivings, even with a God-filled life based on his word that we have given to us, you still can't figure it out. Because God is, by definition, outside of this physical universe. And if we're looking for answers about God inside the physical universe, we're not going to find it because he's outside of it. So he set that in your heart that you would seek him, and yet even in all of your strivings, he's greater than anything you can even think of. It's limited because we are limited. That's sort of the point of this beginning part. We're limited by time. We are limited. So even in our searchings, it's limited. Okay, any thoughts on any of that? I saw some of these, and that means a lot to me. It helps me a lot. Okay. I'm sorry? Don't go to boot camp? What's that? Oh, yeah. So don't go to boot camp if you have late nights like that, is David's advice. Well, in this passage, I think about the passage that we like to go to a lot, Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9, where God says, my ways are not your ways. They're higher than your ways. And my thoughts are not your thoughts. They're higher than your thoughts. I really like those verses, but what's so funny is about the context of Isaiah 55, that's actually about God being close to his people. And yet we use that to say he's so far away. If you read Isaiah 55, it's in the context of God is close to his people. But even in that closeness, we still can't fully understand it. And I think that's the point, which is so related to what we're reading here in these verses. And there should be comfort in that. God has set that in our hearts. It's not wrong to start thinking and wondering about eternity. God has set that in your heart. Okay. Any last thoughts before we keep going here? Yes, sir.
What you said in scripture from a lens of the differentiation between man and the beast of the field, not to bring it back to
that's coming to the end here.
Yes, so a lot of that delineation is the beast of the field are thinking of the here now because we're focused on satisfying their stomachs. Using that as a parallel for sin, if we're closer to the spectrum of sin and leaving God out of the picture, we're just worried on satisfying our nerves too.
Mm-hmm.
And this sort of eternal nature in our heart, it expands that. If we're thinking and playing that God is, we're not focused on the here and now and what's going to satisfy our bellies. We're focused on that eternity. And that's a big delineation of the beast of the field versus what God has created us to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, amen. And we're gonna get to that at the end here for sure, like almost word for word, some of the things you just said. So that's great. Anything else before we keep going here? Okay, let's read verses 12 and 13. So here's this sort of abject despair that can easily come upon us. God comes in the picture, and that despair can go away, even in not fully understanding everything. That despair can go away. And look, we see a repeat of some stuff that we've seen already. Verses 12 and 13 here. I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and do good in one's lifetime. It's great. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is the gift of God. We just saw that in chapter 2, verses 24, really through verses 26. And so Solomon is saying, okay, you're limited by time. These things are going to happen no matter what you do or no matter what you don't do. Time is going to move on, but time's not the controlling factor. God is the master over time, and that's a huge deal. Once God is in the picture, that enables you to do good in your lifetime. That enables you to enjoy the fruits of your labor, and it's the gift of God. It's good to enjoy those things. But then Solomon's going to shift again, because we've seen that in chapter 2. But here, we're going to see a little shift, because even in that, think about enjoying the good things that God gives to us, doing good to others, all those things. Those are great things while we're alive. But even that is limited, isn't it? The good that we do in our lifetime, the things that we enjoy in our lifetime, even that's limited. It's good. It's the gift of God. I'm not saying it's not good, but even that is limited by our lifetime. And we can start to think about that. Well, even the good things that are from God are limited in my lifetime. So then we get another contrast about God. So let's look at, let's see, verses 14 and 15 here. Verse 14 and 15. I know that everything God does, this is a huge contrast, will remain forever. There is nothing to add to it. There's nothing to take from it. For God has so worked that men should fear him. That which is has been already, and that which will be has already been. For God seeks what has passed by. So in this just dramatic contrast, even in the good that we do in our lifetime, even in the good things that we enjoy that are the gift from God, they're still limited. They're still not lasting. That's still a reality. But I love this, verse 14. Everything that God does remains forever. No matter how limited we are, God is not. The things that he does remain forever. And there's nothing to add to it. It's sufficient. There's nothing to take away from it. It is sufficient. For God has so worked that men should fear him. And I love that, because it's so connected to God has set eternity in your hearts that you would search for him. He knows. I'm just telling you, he knows that we have these thoughts late at night. We're like, oh man, what if none of this is real? And like our heart drops to our toes. I don't know. Does anybody else have that experience? Like, you kind of get a little freaked out sometimes. It happens. God knows about that. He put that in your heart so that you would seek him. And he wants you to realize you are limited. Your time is small. I'm outside of time. The stuff that you do, even if it's good, even if it's a gift from God, that's great stuff. But even that's limited. But what God does is not limited. And God has worked that way so that you would fear him. Not fear the unknown eternity and all that stuff, but fear him, because he's the one who's the master over time. Yes, sir.
I know you don't want to skip to.
Yeah, really don't. But you can go ahead.
It is a sign. The conclusion that he comes to survives
Mm-hmm.
man's the purpose that he's seeking with all of these things that we're talking about don't survive time. The ultimate conclusion that he comes to, the one thing that does survive time. That's that serving God and keeping his commandments is not just what we would be doing on this earth, but what we would be doing over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, amen, for sure. And yeah, just amen. Any other comments on this section so far? Yes, sir.
That sentence, at least in my translation, reads, and I'll read it directly from the NIV translation, God does it so that people will fear him. Is that implying that everything that God does is done just so we will fear him, or is that just one of the motivating factors for God to do these things?
I think it's all of it, because that fear is to be in awe of him, to be in reverence for who he is, in contrast to.
I think you're worse than arrogant for me to think that I'm the reason that God created planets that haven't even been discovered yet.
Oh, gotcha.
I can't help but think God's got more on his mind than making sure I hear what I've seen, what he's done so far.
Yeah, that's a great question. I really don't know. Yeah, I don't know what it's like from God's perspective.
All is implying that point of view.
Well, I do think that what he's trying to get across is when you notice mankind's limited nature, and then you bring God into the picture and how unlimited he is, that there's only one appropriate response, and that's to be in awe and fear and reverence. I think so. Yeah, I think so. I could be wrong though. I absolutely, but that's the way that I read it, just in the context of this chapter. Any other thoughts or anything on this section? Yes, sir.
One thought that comes to mind, kind of going back to the end of verse 11. I don't know if this is right or not, but it seems like what Solomon is saying is God has appointed work for you to do, a time for you to make choices. But your choices alone is not the full thing being done.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever choice God has put before me, if I make the right choice, God is still working behind the scenes in ways I do not understand. He has been doing that from the beginning, will do that until the end. And that's kind of what strikes me that Solomon is getting at, is that we need to recognize that as we make those choices, we're not going to understand what God's part in that is. But ultimately, his part will last. And the goal of that is so that we would be in awe of him.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes so much to chapter 1, where Solomon is saying there are things in life that are bent that can't be made straight. There are things that are lacking that can't be counted. If it's just under the sun, just by what we do, we can't do any of that. But God, what does it say here in verse 14? What he does will remain forever, and there's nothing to add to it. There's nothing to take away from it in conjunction with what we are doing. He's just said, do good in your lifetime. Enjoy the fruits of your labor. That's God's gift. So absolutely.
Like the statement in verse 3, the time to build up.
Mm-hmm.
The word we think of as edification. So we are to be involved in the edification, but it's not our work that's actually doing the building. Now that's our goal. I mean, the New Testament is filled with that idea, build each other up. But it's actually God who's doing the building in ways that we do not comprehend.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what makes that eternal building up.
Yeah, absolutely. And it remains forever, eternal. It remains forever. So yeah, great point to bring up there. Something on that as well. Sorry, somebody have something? Okay. I never want to cut you off. So if you start talking and I keep talking, just keep going or shout me down or something. It's totally fine. Verse 15 is sort of a weird verse to me, especially in this section. It's like, what in the world is going on right here? Verse 15, that which is has been already, and that which will be has already been. It's like, okay, we've seen some of that before in Ecclesiastes, but what about this last line? God seeks what has passed by. I thought what God does remains forever. So why is he seeking things that pass by? And just this whole verse, I really think the whole point is God is outside of your, oh man, we're in trouble. God is outside of your limited time perspective. We want to form things and we make our decisions and responses based on verses 1 through 9, which is usually like, okay, what time am I in? What's going on? How am I going to respond? And it's only by the physical things that we can see, the data that we get from that. Okay, this is what I'm going to do. But God is outside of this limited time that we are limited by. And so, the things that he's doing, they remain forever. He already knows what the end is before the beginning. We already saw that here as well. He knows the end from the beginning. And so it's not a problem for God the way that it's a problem for us. He seeks those things which are passed by because he's outside of time. It's not a problem for him at all. Okay, so we got to zoom through this last little section, which is so good. And I'm sorry I've been talking so much. Let's read verses 16. Let's see. Yeah, let's just do 16 through 22, and then we'll break it down a little bit here. 16 through 22. Furthermore, I've seen under the sun, in the place of justice, there's wickedness. In the place of righteousness, there's wickedness. I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man. For a time, for every matter, and for every deed is there. I said to myself concerning the sons of men, God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath. And there's no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place. All came from the dust, and all return to the dust. Here's two questions in verses 21 and 22. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward, and the breath of the beast descends downward to the earth? I have seen that nothing is better than the man should be happy in his activities, for that's his lot. For who will bring him to see what will occur after him? So here in verses 16 and 17, we get our phrase, furthermore, I've seen under the sun. So that should signal and clue to us that maybe God's not in the picture here. That should sort of be the shift that we have in our mind. Because he says, in the place of justice, there's wickedness. In the place of righteousness, there's wickedness. And we see that too, don't we? We know of court cases where somebody is clearly and obviously guilty. Maybe even they admit to being guilty after the court case, but during the trial, they're exonerated. They're let off, they're let free. In the place of justice, there's wickedness. It happens that way sometimes. Or the place of righteousness, there's wickedness. I just think about these charities that have wonderful causes, great cause charities. And then you get these news stories about the board members embezzling the funds or using those funds for things that are just absolutely evil, right? You know those stories? And we just see that in life under the sun all the time. That's what life is like without God for these people. But verse 17, you see God come into the picture because God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man. It doesn't matter if there's justice it doesn't matter if there's wickedness where there should be justice. It doesn't matter if there's wickedness where there should be righteousness. God sees it. It might look like to those people that there's nothing outside of this physical universe, but God sees that. And God's going to judge the righteous man and the wicked man for a time, for every matter, and for every deed is there. So even if we think there's nothing more than this physical universe, God sees that, and he's going to know regardless. Let's go down and talk about verses 18 to 20, because this is great stuff. Here in verses 18 through really 21, the righteous and the wicked both die. The righteous and the wicked both die just like animals. And this is such a fascinating section to me. Verse 18. Was that a bell? Oh, okay, never mind. God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. And so if this physical reality is all that there is, we come to the conclusion that people are animals. That has to be the conclusion, is that people are animals. And I don't know about you all, but in school, that's exactly what they teach. Humans are just another form of animal. And brethren, that is not biblical. You are not an animal. You are not. But if we're going to follow this logic that Solomon is laying out here, if this is all there is, well, we breathe like animals breathe. We're just animals. And when animals die, they're dead. So when we die, we're just kind of dead. Isn't that an awful thing to think about? And so verse 19, he says, the fate of the sons of men is the same as the fate of beasts. You know what? These animals, they die just like humans die. They have the same breath. There's no advantage over the beast if there's no God. So this is vanity. Verse 20, they all go to the same place. They all came from the dust and they're going back to the dust. We die just like the animals and our bodies return to the dust. So I love the question in verse 21. Without God in the picture, who knows that the breath of man ascends upward and the breath of the beast ascends downward to the earth? The idea is that there's life after death here. Who knows? Without God, who knows if there's life after death? That the spirit of man ascends upward and the spirit of the beast, not really. With God in the picture, we know that's the case. I know we love our dogs, we love our animals and stuff. They don't have an eternal spirit like you do. I'm sorry, not all dogs go to heaven. In other words, none of them. But you have an eternal spirit by God. Without God in the picture, it's very bleak. With God in the picture, it is great. So, verse 22, be happy with your lot. You're not going to know what's going to happen to you after you. Okay, Lord willing, chapter 4 next week. Please read chapter 4. Thank you all.